Today from Kentucky, it's episode number 4 of the Word Outreach Podcast. Welcome to a place for encouragement in the Christian walk. My name is Rudy Vaughn. Thanks for coming today. If you're new to the podcast, we are in the middle of looking at 3 kinds of evidence for the resurrection. In this episode, I'm going to be talking about that second kind of supporting evidence. We've also been enjoying the interview with New Tribes missionaries Ace and Betty Draper. Today, we'll learn about encouraging missionaries, why missionaries keep going back to their mission fields, and why you and I should keep going back to ours also. If you're like me and you want to grow in your Christian faith, if you enjoy hearing the stories of today's missionaries, you've come to a good place. Welcome to the Word Outreach Podcast. I want to start off today talking about a simple way to remember the outline for the 3 kinds of evidence for the resurrection. The first kind of evidence was the evidence that gets its facts from historical documents. And by the way, if you missed the last episode, you can hear about the first kind of evidence by going to wordoutreach.org/3, as in episode 3. The second kind of evidence is what we'll talk about today. It's the evidence that gets in the way of other explanations. And the third kind of evidence is the evidence that gets its credibility from eyewitness testimony. And we'll look at this in the next episode. If you can remember the outline for the 3 kinds of evidence for the resurrection, then that will get you started on the road to remembering what the evidence actually is. So here is a simple way to remember the outline. Just one chapter. If you can remember where to find just one important chapter in the Bible, then I think you can easily remember the outline for the 3 kinds of evidence. The chapter is 1 Corinthians chapter 15. If you start reading in 1 Corinthians 15, you'll notice that the topic of the resurrection comes up in verse 3, and that's where the outline begins for the 3 kinds of evidence. The Apostle Paul writes in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 through 9, "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received." Now, when you see the word received, that reminds us of the first kind of evidence, and here's why. Paul received information about the resurrection and the gospel directly from Christ. Galatians chapter 1, verse 12 talks about this. You and I received information about the resurrection from the writings of Paul and other people that God used to write the scriptures. But someone who has a non-Christian worldview doesn't care about the fact that Paul received information from Christ or that we received information from the scriptures. If there is any evidence to be received, they want to receive it from historical documents. And that's what the first kind of evidence is about. It's the evidence that gets its facts from historical documents. So when I see the word received, that reminds me of the first kind of evidence. And then it reads that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures, that he was buried, and that he was raised on the 3rd day in accordance with the scriptures. These phrases that say that Christ died for our sins, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the 3rd day, these phrases remind me of the second kind of evidence. It's the evidence that gets in the way of other explanations. And over the years, there have been other explanations that have been targeted at the death of Christ, the burial of Christ, and the resurrection. So these phrases remind me of the second kind of evidence. Verses 5 through 9 remind us of the third kind of evidence. It's the evidence that gets its credibility from eyewitness testimony. It says in verse 5, "And that he appeared to Cephas," which is another name for Peter, "and then to the 12. And then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep," which means they died. "And then he appeared to James, and then to all the apostles, and last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me." And then Paul writes, "For I am the least of the apostles, unworthy to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church." So these remaining verses remind me of this third kind of evidence, the evidence that gets its credibility from eyewitness testimony. So if you think you might have an opportunity to talk with someone about the resurrection, just go to 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and begin reading, and hopefully you'll begin to be prompted about what the different parts of the outline are, as you begin reading verses 3 through 9. Received reminds us of the first kind of evidence. The death, burial, and resurrection reminds us of the second. And then when it talks about the people who saw Christ, that reminds us of the third. Well, I'm excited about talking to you today about the explanations that people have had for the resurrection and the evidence that gets in their way. We're going to look at the death that some say never actually happened, and then we'll look at the burial spot that some say became a crime scene. And then I'll be talking about the resurrection discovery that some say happened at the wrong tomb. But before we get started, let's jump back into the interview with Ace and Betty Draper with New Tribes Mission. They served in Bolivia and Papua New Guinea. Wow. So your families are going right there and right in the middle of the jungle with the people. Is that right?
Yeah. In a lot of countries it's very jungly, and there's other parts of the world that's not. Mm-hmm. There are different environments that we go into. In Papua New Guinea, it's basically jungle, high mountainous areas also like that, and then some islands that we are in. So very tropical, very jungly over there. But many parts of the world, it's desert or whatever. So it's just wherever the least reached are. That's our goal, is to go to them.
Now you have transitioned now to a new phase called member care, and now you're based in the United States, but you're still directly involved in what goes on overseas. Betty, how does that work? Tell us about what is member care and why is this important?
Well, we working with all the young couples that come over with their kids on overseas or across the sea, and watching them go through all the things that they do kind of makes what we're doing right now not easier, but it helps us give a better understanding because we've been in these tribes that they're in. We've watched them as they went through their struggles of having to homeschool their kids all the time and being remotely cut off from the only way to get into them is maybe by helicopter or hiking in at times too for 2 days. So having to do all those things that we normally do in the States, but you're cut off from everything, just takes longer time. And so they come, they go out very young, most of them, and they take their young kids, and it's a very risky thing that they do. They can, they believe it's worth it because of the end result of people coming to know the Lord. And so because we've been there and we've seen where they've lived and we know and understand how they feel, now when they come home from any 27 countries that New Tribe serves in, there are people like us that have served overseas for a number of years that are going to be their member care contact. And one of the first things we'll do is when they get back to the States is just contact them and say, hey, what can we do while you're here? Is there a time we can get with you? Just building that relationship, just helping them to know they've got somebody that they can talk to, that they will understand what they've been through. So that's probably the biggest thing, just knowing that somebody else really understands what you've done, what you've been through, what you've seen, what you've been exposed to, just helps them.
Are there missionary families out there right now that are just worn out?
Oh, yes.
Tired?
Yes. Yes, it's a physically hard ministry that they're in, just because everything, and most of the places have to be cooked from scratch. Everything has to be flown in that they even cook from scratch. And so it's just a very hard physical, mental, and emotionally and spiritually ministry for those. So they're ready to come home after 3 or 4 years on the field. But I think sometimes they're not ready for the culture shock they'll face when they get back here to the United States. And that alone right there, just helping them walk through those stages of what culture shock is like, to come back into the United States with all of its abundance and everything is just there for anything you could want is just there, and into a people group that they've grown up with all their life, but yet they've been exposed to something beyond what most people have been exposed to. And so that's part of our ministry. Again, will be just helping them walk through those stages that you go through when you come home.
When a missionary from any mission organization comes home and is tired, what can we do for them? If we meet a missionary who's come back, tell us, because you've got the inside track here, what do they need from us so we don't make them more tired?
I think missionaries that are coming home, I like to hear their story. What have you experienced in the last 3 or 4 years? Share some of the joy that you've seen, the encouragement. How was language study? How's that going for you? So I think listening to their story is very important. In ourselves, it's an impossible job, but in Christ, He's the one that makes us able. And just to continue to remind ourselves of that it's Him working in and through us to do the job. Being a listening ear is very important. I think encouraging them to take their time at their home to refresh, to be sure they're communicating to their friends and family, and they do have some culture adjustment back here. That's normal. So many choices here in America. That's normal enough to know how to make those choices. So yeah, just give themselves time.
You were one of those tired missionaries when you were in Bolivia and Papua New Guinea, and every time you came home, you were tired, but you went back. So that is my question. Why did you go back? Because you were tired. Why did you go? Why do these missionaries keep going back? In a few minutes, we're going to hear the answer to that question, and there are some important things that we can learn from what they have to say. When we look at the evidence today, it's important to understand that we're looking at a different kind of evidence than we looked at in the last episode. In the last episode, we looked at evidence that had to do with historical documents. But today, we're looking at evidence that has to do with logical reasoning. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 through 5 mention the three major parts of the resurrection story: the death, burial, and the resurrection itself on the third day. But from the very beginning of the news about Christ being risen from the dead, and throughout the years, people have offered other explanations. In fact, each of these three areas, the death, burial, and resurrection discovery on the third day, have been targeted. So let's look at all three. First is the death that some say never actually happened. That's right. Some people say that Jesus never actually died. Some say he fainted on the cross, and there are others who claim that his body was switched with someone else that was made to look like him, and so someone else actually died. Second, we're going to look at the burial site that some say became a crime scene. From that very first day, the rumor had begun that the body of Jesus had been stolen by the disciples, so that it would look like that there was a resurrection. And then that third explanation is about the resurrection discovery that some say was made at the wrong tomb. Some claim that this is a whole lot about nothing, because the women just made an honest mistake. They actually went to the wrong tomb, and they thought that Jesus had been resurrected. Well, these are a few of the explanations, but there is logical reasoning that gets in the way. First, let's look at the death that some say never actually happened. If you're going to talk to people about the resurrection, then you may come across people who don't believe Jesus ever really died at all. I have. So it's important to be familiar with why this is not a legitimate claim. The first theory about this says that he didn't actually die, but he just fainted. Some call it the swoon theory. It's spelled S-W-O-O-N. To swoon means to faint from extreme emotion, and some say that that is exactly what happened to Jesus. Well, there are two problems with this theory. First is the strength that he needed to leave the tomb, and second is the appearance that he needed to seem victorious after he left the tomb. First, let's think about the strength that he needed to leave the tomb. The beatings, the crucifixion, it was all horrible. His whippings would have brought him almost to the point of death. He was hit. He had a crown of thorns placed on his head. He had nails driven in his hands and his feet. A spear was thrust through his side to make sure that he was dead. He hung on the cross for 6 hours. After all of this, Jesus would be without food or water for 2 days before it would be discovered that he was missing. Well, the theory that says he only fainted, he didn't actually die, says that he woke up and he walked out of the tomb on his own. But the fact is, there are two major obstacles that he would have faced. The first is the heaviness of the stone. The stone that he would have had to roll away was between 1 and 2 tons. That's between 2,000 and 4,000 pounds. And because of the groove the stone would have been sitting in, he would have actually had to roll that stone uphill to get out. But even if he made it that far, he would face a second obstacle, and that would have been the Roman soldiers who were guarding the tomb. I just can't imagine the soldiers not noticing the effort of someone trying to push a 2,000 to 4,000 pound stone uphill at the entrance of the only place that they were guarding. One reason this theory just does not work is because of the strength that he needed to leave the tomb. But the second reason is because of the appearance that he needed to seem victorious after he left the tomb. You see, Jesus had convinced people that he had conquered death. Imagine someone like I just described who had been through all these beatings and torture, someone who had lost so much blood and had not had any food or water. Imagine them being able to convince others that he was a victorious, risen Lord. The thought of that is just crazy. It's not logical. It's not rational thinking. So that's the first theory about the death that some say never actually happened. The second explanation that people have about the death of Christ is taught by Islam. It teaches that it had been arranged for someone else to take on the appearance of Christ, so Christ did not actually die, but someone else died in his place. Now, in case you didn't know, Islam teaches that Jesus was a prophet of Allah, and Muslims hold him in high regard. It's taught that Jesus ascended into heaven, and one day he will return to earth. But Islam does not teach that Jesus ever died. So who, according to Muslim teachings, took Jesus' place on the cross? Well, there are two possibilities according to Muslim scholars. First, it may have been one of Christ's enemies, such as Judas Iscariot. Jesus had already gone to heaven, but he had given his physical image to Judas. So the soldiers came, thought they were taking Christ, but instead actually took Judas and crucified him. And the second possibility is that Jesus asked one of his followers to volunteer. And so one of his followers would take on the appearance of Christ, and that's who was actually beaten and crucified and put in the tomb. Well, if someone is going to hold to this theory, then there are some important questions that need to be considered. First is the question about the reaction of the disciples. You see, the followers of Christ were convinced of the resurrection, and because of it, there was a tremendous growth in Christianity. History records that they were convinced that he had risen from the dead. It's not disputed. So here's my first question. Why would his followers be convinced of a resurrection if they knew that he really did not die? If they knew that the body had actually been switched? And then there are important questions about the deception. This comes from the fact that this teaching makes Jesus appear to be a deceiver. Now, in Islam, Jesus is very respected. He's considered to be a prophet. Islam does not teach that Jesus had a deceptive heart, but in this teaching, he appears to be using his supernatural powers to make people think that he has died when he actually hasn't. So if someone holds to this teaching, here are some important questions that I think that he or she should consider. Would a prophet engage in deception? And how can this prophet Jesus be considered good when at the same time he is planning something that is bad? How can one be a true prophet of Allah and at the same time be deceiving the people around him? So there's that question about how the disciples reacted on that third day after he was crucified. The fact is, they believed that he had been resurrected. And then there's that second topic about the deception of Christ. Would a true prophet really act in a deceptive way? But this third topic is about the idea of a good teacher encouraging his followers to help him in deceiving the world. You see, this person would supernaturally be taking on the physical image of Jesus. This teaching shows the prophet of Allah to be asking others to become a part of a great conspiracy. So here's an important question. How can we call him a good teacher if he is asking his students to lie? The idea that a prophet of Allah would deceive others and ask his followers to take part in this deception is an idea that seems to be dishonoring and very disrespectful to one of Allah's prophets. And in addition to that, if this was supposed to be Allah's plan, then this teaching seems to be very disrespectful to Allah himself. I just can't imagine a Muslim feeling good about the idea of being disrespectful towards Allah or one of his prophets. So these are the two theories that promote the idea of a death that some say never actually happened, the swoon theory and the theory promoted by Islam. And if you and I have a chance to talk with someone about this, it's important that we do it with gentleness and respect. The second explanation is about the burial site that some say became a crime scene. The theory says that the body was stolen by the disciples. But before we presume that the disciples would even attempt such a thing, we need to consider a couple of things. First, what the disciples would have faced, and second, who the disciples were on this particular weekend. First, let's talk about what the disciples would have faced. They would have faced the challenge of overcoming the Roman guards. The day after the crucifixion, the chief priests and Pharisees went to Pilate, and they requested the governor to make the tomb secure in case the disciples came and stole the body. Pilate had a guard of soldiers placed at the tomb. So an important question is, how many soldiers actually protected the tomb? Well, the minimum number that scholars think guarded the tomb was 4. And that's because a Roman guard was made up of 4 soldiers. A soldier would stand watch for 3 hours at a time, and in this way, 4 soldiers could be taking turns during a 12-hour period, each soldier guarding for 3 hours at a time. And that way, some could get some sleep. So scholars believe that the minimum number for guarding the tomb would be 4 soldiers. However, in Acts chapter 12, when Herod the king, who had adopted Roman customs, when he had Peter guarded, there was a guard ordered by him to be made up of 4 squads of soldiers, and each squad would be 4 soldiers. So that's a total of 16. Jesus would have naturally been considered to be a more controversial public figure than Peter, so it's possible that the number of soldiers guarding him could have been as high as Peter's, maybe 16. But at the bare minimum, scholars feel there would have at least been 4. So why does it even matter how many soldiers guarded the tomb? Well, it's because it helps us to understand what the disciples would have faced if they had decided to steal the body. They would have faced at least 4, maybe even more, highly trained Roman soldiers. These soldiers were not only physically fit, but they were held to the highest of standards when it comes to being a soldier. There is no way that they were going to let anyone steal that body without putting up a major fight. But the guard of soldiers is not the only obstacle that the disciples would have had to face. They would have also had to face the consequences of breaking the Roman seal. The Roman seal stood for the power and the authority of the Roman Empire. It was made up of something soft attached to the stone, probably made of clay, and if someone could get past the guards, breaking the seal would bring very severe consequences. Automatic execution by crucifixion, upside down. People feared the Roman government, and the Roman seal was an emotional barrier to anyone who would think of entering the tomb, because it would be signing your own death warrant. So if I'm going to suggest that the disciples would actually attempt to steal the body of Jesus, then I need to consider first what the disciples would face. They would face the challenge of the Roman guard, and they would face the consequences of breaking the Roman seal. But I also need to consider who the disciples were on this particular weekend. So on this weekend, who were they? Well, they were discouraged and scared men. That's who they were. These men were obviously discouraged. Their best friend and their leader had just died, but they were also scared. Remember Peter? After Peter saw what the government was doing and the intimidation of the soldiers, he denied that he knew Christ, not once, but 3 times. And John chapter 20, verse 19 tells us that they were staying in a locked room for fear of the Jews. They were hiding. Why were they scared? You see, if the Jewish leaders had convinced the Roman government to kill their leader, would they also be coming after them, the followers? So why does it matter who the disciples were on this particular weekend, that they were discouraged and that they were scared? Well, here's why it matters. Because this is not the kind of group that would have the courage to attempt to overcome what they might face at the tomb, the Roman guard of soldiers and the Roman seal of authority. Going against any of these would bring the harshest of penalties. When you and I are talking with someone about the resurrection, and the idea comes up that the disciples probably stole the body, we need to ask our friends, are you aware of what the disciples would have faced if they tried this? And are you aware of who the disciples were on this particular weekend? The fact is, most people aren't even considering these things. But let's just say that they did have the courage to attempt to steal the body. It's hard to imagine that the soldiers would sleep through the whole ordeal of the disciples coming and rolling away a 2,000-pound to 4,000-pound stone, going in, and then taking the body out. Consider this. If you were a Roman soldier, the consequences for failing at your duty for guarding a prisoner was death, and sometimes the execution was done in a horrible way. It could mean being burned alive. In fact, execution came to the soldiers who guarded Peter in Acts 12. The soldiers feared their superiors. They would give their best to make sure that they were not going to fail at their jobs. But let's pretend for a moment that the disciples were successful and they were able to steal the body. There are 3 important questions that need to be answered. The first question is about the search. Why wasn't there a search begun for the body? The second question is about the hunt. Why weren't the disciples hunted down by the Jewish leaders and the Roman government? And the third question is about the charges. Why weren't there charges brought against the disciples? Well, the truth about the search is that the Jewish leaders had no need to begin a search for the body because the soldiers had told them what had happened. And the truth about the hunt? Well, when the disciples realized that the resurrection really was a fact, they came out of hiding and they were not hunted down by the government for stealing the body. And the truth about the charges? Well, there were no charges brought against the disciples. So if you're having a conversation about Christianity and this explanation comes up, that the disciples stole the body to make it look like a resurrection, remember the logical reasoning that puts this idea to rest. First, the disciples were too discouraged and too scared to face the challenge of a very trained Roman guard and the consequences of breaking a Roman seal. Second, moving a 1 to 2 ton stone would have woken up the soldiers if they were sleeping. Third, history does not record a search for the body, a hunt for the disciples, or charges brought against the disciples. And number 4, Roman soldiers were under a death threat if they failed in their duties. They took their job seriously, and even through the night, it is unlikely that all the soldiers would have been sleeping at the same time. So we've looked at the supporting evidence that gets in the way of 2 explanations. First, the death that some say never happened, and secondly, the burial spot that some say became a crime scene. But there is one more explanation that we're going to look at today. The third kind of explanation is the resurrection discovery that some say was made at the wrong tomb. According to the very well-respected historian Luke and the writer of the Gospel of Luke, the tomb was owned by a wealthy religious leader who was from the town of Arimathea in Judea. He was a member of the Jewish High Council, but he did not agree with their decisions. He had actually become a follower of Christ, and so he asked Pilate for the body of Jesus. And then he took the body down from the cross, wrapped it in a long sheet of linen cloth, and he laid it in a new tomb. So one theory that people have had about the resurrection is that on Sunday morning, the women went to the wrong tomb, and that's why they said that the body was missing. Well, the problem with that theory, though, is that the historian Luke, as well as Matthew and Mark, tell us that both Mary Magdalene and the other Mary were sitting across from the tomb watching while the body was being put there. So obviously the women knew where the tomb was, and they went to the correct place. And of course, Joseph of Arimathea, the one who owned the tomb, he knew where the tomb was, and he could have corrected the story if it was wrong. But even more compelling than the fact that the women saw which tomb the body was being laid in, even more compelling than that is the fact that the chief priests did not go and open up the tomb for everyone to see the corpse. If there was anyone that would have liked to disprove the resurrection, it would have been the religious leaders. because they were the ones that had Jesus put to death. They could have gone to Pilate and asked him to remove the seal, to open the tomb for everyone to see, but the fact was, of course, the tomb had already been opened by an angel, and God himself had raised his son. So the important question here is, if the resurrection discovery was made at the wrong tomb, then why didn't the Jewish leaders go to the correct tomb and provide a body for everyone to see? Well, the answer is obvious. There was just not a dead body to provide for the people to see. Instead, there was a risen Lord. Romans 1:16 tells us that the gospel is the power of God unto salvation, and that is a good reason to talk with others about the death, burial, and resurrection. Well, there's an important question to be answered by Ace and Betty, but first I want to invite you to come back for a very special episode number 5. Not only will we be looking at the third kind of evidence for the resurrection, but we're also going to hear about Christmas in other parts of the world. Here, take a listen.
My name is Seth, and I'm a missionary with Word of Life in Poland.
Hello, my name is Diana Turley, and my family and I have been missionaries in Brazil for 25 years.
This is Mike Nichols, here in the heart of Asia, South Korea.
This is Vincent
and Julie Mbalango
from Uganda, wishing you a Merry, Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. God's blessing.
I plan to have this next episode out the Monday before Christmas, but just in case you're not familiar, if you want to get an automatic update, the best thing to do is to subscribe in iTunes, and you can go to wordoutreach.org/iTunes, and it will automatically be downloaded to your smartphone or tablet or computer. Okay, let's get back to the interview with Ace and Betty. Every time you came home, you were tired, but you went back. So that is my question. Why did you go back? Because you were tired. Why did you go? Why do these missionaries keep going back?
Well, I think this one to be obedient to what the Lord has told us to do is to go into all the world, and it's Him. We go back because it's worth it. You know,
it's worth it.
It's worth it. Yeah, He's worthy to be praised, and where there's no worship in an area of the world, we need to be there.
It's a good word. Betty, do you have something you want to say?
Well, I was just thinking through all the struggles and all the hard times, and there was many times. Of course, I wish that we didn't have to go back with one child over here, and his family, and then the other daughter our daughter overseas. We were pulled back and forth between the two, and so just getting past that, what I don't want to do or what I want to do, it's getting past the I. I think that's universal. I don't think it matters what country you live in or what you've been exposed to. Anything Christ asks us to do, we've got to get through the I and past that to where we're thinking Him. And I said it before, I would not go to any foreign country to do anything else. I commend people who are adventurous and like to do that kind of thing. I think it's great. But a missionary normally buys a one-way ticket. It's not for a short term that they go, and thank God for short-term missions, but the career missionaries buy a one-way ticket, and it's not just a little piece of their life, it becomes your life. And that I think is what keeps you going back. You knowing that the airplanes are not filled with people that have bought a one-way ticket to live overseas. So I think that thought for me especially was the thing that would keep me going back, help me get over the homesickness from missing either one of our children. We were home in the States, we missed our daughter. When we were overseas, we missed our son. And that feeling that we're missing out on all our grandkids and things that they're doing. It's just being obedience, like Ace said, to that call. I just want to add this. Women ask me this all the time. When was I called to be a missionary? And I'm very honest and tell them I've never been called to be a missionary. I'm commanded to be a missionary wherever God has me. And he has so blessed me by allowing me to live in all these countries. Even though I never seen it as a blessing many, many times, but it has been a blessing. I don't regret it. But I am commanded to be a missionary. I am called to be a helpmate as a woman to the man that I'm married to. And so from the very beginning, that's part of what helped that transition of being obedient to what God wanted me to do. I didn't have to have any feelings necessarily, like feeling like I wanted to go over there so bad, but I had a heart to do what God wanted me to do and obey him, and that was to be a helpmate. And he just happened to take this helpmate to Bolivia, South America, and then to Papua New Guinea. And I've never regretted it. Never regretted it, even though there's been hard times. Yeah.
Have you ever been with a group of people? You looked around and realized that so many of them were not Christians, and you became burdened for them. You wanted God to use you in their life. Or maybe it's one person, maybe it's an individual down the road, and when you spend time with them, you become burdened for them. Well, at that moment, you are seeing that environment as a mission field. But if you're like me, as time goes by, you stop praying for them. You stop seeing them in the same way. You stop looking at them through the eyes of a missionary. Well, there are important reasons for you and I to go back into that environment as a missionary. There are important reasons to go back to our mission field. And here are 4 good reasons that Ace and Betty have given us.
Well, I think this one to be obedient to what the Lord has told us to do is to go into all the world.
So the first obvious reason is because we're commanded to. Jesus wants us to see the world as a mission field.
We go back because it's worth it,
It's worth it.
It's worth it,
It is worth going back to the mission field, and here are 2 reasons. First, you have a chance to be used by God. This is a chance to be used for something that matters for eternity's sake. This is a chance to be used in God's kingdom. It is worth going back as a missionary. And secondly, you and I get a chance to see lives changed. Maybe it's a person who used to laugh at the whole idea of a resurrection, but now they've come to the place where they are considering the possibility that it could be true. Or maybe your relationship is finally developed where they're asking you some questions about Christ. It is worth going back to the mission field. It's worth all the conversations. It's worth the praying. When you finally have a chance to meet your friend in the lobby of the church on Sunday morning, because for the first time, he's going to go to church with you. These are the kind of things that make it worth it.
He's worthy to be praised, and where there's no worship in an area of the world, we need to be there.
God is worthy to be praised. He is deserving of worship. He is the Creator. And people who don't connect with the Creator will never have true fulfillment in life. This is a good reason to go back to the mission field, because God deserves to be worshiped.
That, I think, is what keeps you going back. Knowing that the airplanes are not filled with people that have bought a one-way ticket to live overseas. So I think that thought for me especially was the thing that would keep me going back.
Betty recognized that most of the people on the plane didn't have one-way tickets. Most of the people were not career missionaries in this kind of way. Why do you and I need to keep going back to the mission field? Because most of the people who go to the places that we go don't see that place as a mission field. Most of the people in our neighborhoods, our workplaces, our schools, our sports teams, our clubs, most of the people who show up are not considering those meetings to also be a mission field. So we need to go back because we're commanded. We need to go back because it's worth it. We need to go back to the mission field because God is worthy to be praised. And the final reason we need to go back is because if you and I don't go back to our particular mission field, who else is going to go? Who else is going to see that particular place as a mission field? But first, before you and I go back to the mission field, there is something important that needs to happen in our heart.
But I am commanded to be a missionary. I am called to be a helpmate as a woman to the man that I'm married to. And so from the very beginning, that's part of what helped that transition of being obedient to what God wanted me to do. I didn't have to have any feelings necessarily, like feeling like I wanted to go over there so bad, but I had a heart to do what God wanted me to do and obey him, and that was to be a helpmate. And he just happened to take this helpmate to Bolivia, South America.
If you and I want to be used by God, first, we need a heart of obedience. Betty had made a decision to honor what God said about marriage and being a helpmate to her husband. Many people talk of wanting to be used by God, and they have different ideas, but what God wants first is a heart of obedience. He wants me to be the kind of Christian that is interested in his guidelines and principles for living in the Bible. This is what God wants first from us, a heart of obedience, because it's a heart of obedience that God uses on the mission field. You can find the internet links that I used in my research about today's topic and the link for New Tribes Mission by going to the show notes for episode 4 at wordoutreach.org/4. And you can also subscribe to the podcast by going to /iTunes. In the next episode, we're going to be looking at that third kind of evidence. It's the evidence that gets its credibility from eyewitness testimony. And it's also a special Christmas episode where we'll hear from missionaries about Christmas in other countries. I hope today was an encouragement to you in your Christian walk. Thank you for listening.